Masechet Baba Batra Daf Ayin Aleph, a new Mishnah. It's actually a continuation of the previous Mishnah. If I sell you a field and I don't specify what in the field is going to be sold along with it, so then here's the law. Lo et habor velo et hagat velo et hashobach ben charebin ben ishuvin. So if I sell you a field, that does not include a cistern that's in the field, nor a wine press or a dovecote. Whether they are abandoned or they're currently being used, it doesn't matter. These are significant items in and of themselves, and you don't just call them part of the field. It's its own thing. And so if the buyer wants to make sure that he owns, that he buys these things also, he has to specify, I'm getting the field, and I want to make sure that you're including the wine press. Now, if I sell you a field, and that is just the field, and you didn't say anything else, so I keep the cistern and the wine press, but I don't keep any part of the field, and therefore, according to the Bi'akiba, I have to buy from you the right to have a pathway to get to the cistern, because, as we saw earlier, Rabbi Akiba says that a seller sells be'ayin yafa. He wants to sell. He wants to be generous. He's getting money, after all, for what he's selling. And so we assume that he does not include the cistern and the wine press themselves, because that's not part of the field. That's a separate item. But when he sells the field, he sells the entire field, including the right for anyone to trespass. And therefore, even though the seller keeps the cistern, nevertheless, he has to rent out or buy a right to of a pathway through it so that he can get to the cistern. Hachamim say no, he does not have to, because Hachamim think that a seller sells be'ayin ra'ah. A seller is more stingy. He's going to sell the minimum amount that he has to. And therefore, he says, yes, I'm selling you the field. For sure, you get the field. But since I'm keeping for myself the cistern, so implied in that is a way to get to the cistern. Of course, I had that in mind. I want to keep that for myself. And therefore, the seller does not have to acquire a pathway to get there. Now, Rabbi Akiba agrees that if I, as the seller, say, I am selling you the field except for the cistern and the wine press or the dovecote. In that case, since I specifically excluded that from the sale, I said I'm keeping the cistern, then even Rabbi Akiba would agree that I do not have to purchase a pathway, because since I said I'm keeping the cistern, so those words, what's the point? I'm keeping the cistern anyway. So what does these extra words mean? So the extra words, I'm selling you the field except for the cistern, that's coming to include that I am keeping for myself a pathway, and even Rabbi Akiba would agree with that. Mecharan le'acher. Rabbi Akiba omer eno sarich likach lo derech. Chachamim omrim sarich likach lo derech. And now we flip it around. If I'm the seller, I own a field with a cistern in it, and now I'm selling you just the cistern. So, according to Rabbi Akiba, the buyer does not have to acquire a pathway, because it's the same principle. Rabbi Akiva says that the seller sells be'ayin yafa, generously. So I'm selling you the cistern, I'm getting good money for it, so we assume that I want to sell you a pathway as well. Pathway included. Hachamim, however, say that a seller sells in a stingy way. I sold you only the cistern, that's all I said. I didn't say I'm selling you a pathway to get there, to get the water, and therefore the buyer has to acquire that separately. All of that law that we just said is talking about a seller. But if you're giving a gift, then everything is included, meaning that includes the cistern and the wine press and the dovecote. All these things, if I'm selling it to you, so if I'm selling, then I want to sell you the minimum that I need to in order to make the money that I'm making. And we said only land, so that does not include any of the other items. But if I'm giving a gift, we assume that a gift giver is very generous. So generous, not only that he's including a pathway, that's for sure. This goes beyond the machloket between Chachamim and Rabbi Akiba. Their machloket is only about if I keep a cistern, am I keeping the pathway or not? But when it comes to a gift, someone who gives a gift, obviously he wants to be very generous, and he gets all these items that are in the field. Not everything in the field. It still would not include like grain, cut grain, food, and other things that are in the field. These movable objects, that still is not included, but it does include the items that we just listed, like a cistern and a winepress. Hachin shechalku zachu besadeh, zachu bechulaha. Now, if brothers inherit, their father died, and the father had a big field with cisterns and wine presses on it and all that, and they decide that they're going to split it. And this side, one brother is going to get the west side of the field, and the other brother is going to get the east side of the field. They get the entire field and everything in it as well, because we assume that that's what they want. They each want the total control of everything in the field, including the cistern. So if there's a cistern on the western field, then the brother on the eastern side is implying that, yes, I'm willing to give this to you. I want you to have that, because he wants to get the wine press that's on the eastern side of the field. So they are granting to each other fully everything that's in the field. Kind of like it's a gift. Because it's mutually beneficial. And also, if there is a convert who dies without any heirs, he may have biological heirs before his conversion, but they don't count as legal heirs in Jewish law. And so he dies and he has no children after his conversion. So anything, his property, the law is whoever comes and takes possession of it first gets it. So if someone comes and takes possession of his field, let's say he locks the gate of the field, he gets not only the field but also the cistern and the winepress and the dovecotes that are in it. And here it's because he's not alive. It's different from a seller. The seller wants to keep as much as he can, and so he says, I only sold you the field, I didn't sell you the cistern. But here it's ownerless. And so anyone who comes and takes it, and they have in mind, I'm going to take everything in it, so yeah, they get everything in it. המקדיש את השדה, הקדיש את כולה. רבי שמעון אומר, המקדיש את השדה, לא הקדיש אלא את החרוב המורכב ואת סדן השקמה. Someone consecrates a field. He says, this field here that I own, I am consecrating it to the Bet HaMikdash. So the entire thing is consecrated, including the cistern and the winepress and the dovecote, because the consecration, according to Tanakama, is like a gift. He's doing it for his free will. He's not getting anything back. He's not selling. He's not buying, getting any money for it. And so we assume that he wants to be generous, very generous, and he wants to donate all of the items in it, like the cistern. However, Rabbi Shimon compares giving hekdesh more like a sale, and therefore he says, I want my field to be consecrated. He only said field. That's all he meant. Only the field is consecrated, and not the cistern, and not the wine press, or not those types of things. However, there is an exception to his rule that he does include in this hekdesh, and that is developed trees. Now, normally, a grafted carob tree or a sycamore tree that grows to a certain amount, such that you're cutting it off. So these, since they're big, are considered a separate entity. When they're small, they're just considered part of the field. But when they're big, because they are special and significant in and of themselves, if I sell you a field, I usually will keep these big trees. So, since Rabbi Shimon says that hekdesh is more like a sale, and I keep the cistern and the wine press, really it should be that I also keep the trees. The thing is, these are exceptional, as the Gemara soon will explain, because I am donating the land, and these trees are getting sustenance from the land, and I don't want to violate my hekdesh. And since all of the land I gave to the Bet HaMikdash, if I keep these trees and they're getting sustenance from hekdesh land, then I may be violating hekdesh. And so therefore, the owner has that in mind, and when he gives the land, he's also going to give as hekdesh the trees that get nutrients from the land, which does not apply to a cistern or a wine press that are just sitting there in the land or on top of the land, and are not getting any nourishment from the land. That is the Mishnah. Gemara says, "My shana mecheru, my shana matana." Gemara is asking, what's the difference between a sale, in which if I sell you land, I keep the cistern, versus a gift. If I gift you, I just say I'm gifting you land, then the cistern goes along with it. So we explained the psychological difference, because generally someone who is selling wants to give less. He's getting money for it, so I'll charge more money if I'm going to give that to you also. And giving a gift wants to be more generous. But still, he only said land, so maybe he didn't mean that. So Gemara is going to explain this further. Perash Yehuda ben Nekosa lifnei Rabbi. Ze perash veze lo perash. Yehuda Yehuda ben Nekosa explained this section of the Mishnah in front of Rabbi Yehuda Anasi. It's interesting because Rabbi Yehuda Anasi is the editor of the Mishnah, so why doesn't he someone else to explain it to him? But the truth is that Rabbi Yehuda Anasi did not compose from scratch all the words of the Mishnah. He often took older traditions, oral traditions, and arranged them and edited and put them in. So even Rabbi Yehuda Anasi may have received an oral tradition from a generation or two before, and he asked, what does this mean? And so Yehuda ben Nekosa gave an interpretation. Anyway, he said, this person specified and that person didn't, meaning that the person who gives a gift, he specified and said, I'm giving you land, and I'm specifying also, I'm going to include the cistern and the winepress. Whereas the seller did not specify anything, and that's why the seller keeps for himself the cistern and the winepress. Now, I guess that would explain it, but the Mishnah doesn't say anything about that. So Gemara asks, Hai ze perash, veze lo perash, ze lo perash, veze lo perashu. What, you're telling me that this Mishnah is a case where one of the people specified, I want to give it to you, the cistern, and the other one did not specify that? That's not true. The wording of the Mishnah doesn't say anything about that. That would be a really important detail to know, because really in that case, the difference is not between a seller and a gifter, but rather whether we specified that you're giving this item or not. In fact, in the Mishnah, in neither case does it say that they specified anything. Right? In both cases, they just said, I'm giving you land or I'm selling you land, and didn't specify anything else, and yet the outcome is different. So we misunderstood what he said. Rather, Yehuda ben Nekosa's explanation is that the buyer, in the case of a sale, should have specified and said, listen, I'm paying you $100,000 for this field, and the buyer should have specified and said, and I want to make sure you know that this is including that wine press. I want to make sure that's included. Make sure to put that in. So the buyer, it's his responsibility to specify what he wants included in the sale. You can't just say, I'm going to buy your land and assume that everybody's supposed to know. I'm supposed to know that the cistern is included. So the buyer should have specified. If the buyer doesn't specify, then he loses out. He didn't say anything, so he gets only the land, and I'm going to keep for myself the cistern. Whereas the gift receiver could not have specified. Could you imagine? I come and I give you a gift. As you know what, I want to give you a gift of land. And then you say, wait a second, I want to make sure you're including the cistern. Right, I'm giving you a gift. I gift you my house. Oh, wait, does it include the coffee table? Make sure to put, I want it in writing that the coffee table also comes in. Wait, I'm giving you a gift. Beggars can't be choosers. And so it doesn't make sense for a receiver of a gift to have to specify. And that's why, since his lack of specifying is not meaningful, he was having in mind, I'd really like to receive all the items in the land. And therefore, we assume that his lack of specification does not mean that it was necessarily excluded. So that's the main difference between a buyer and a gift receiver, whether it's appropriate for them to specify, I want the cistern also, or whether it's not appropriate. Hahu damar lehu, havu le leplanya beta da machazik mea gulfe, ishtakach tahava machazik mea ve'asrin, amar mor zutra, mea amar le, mea ve'asrin la amar le. We're bringing in this case because we're going to learn an answer to this case from our Mishnah. But there's two different interpretations of it, two different opinions, Mor Zutra and Rav Ashi. The case is someone says to someone else, he's on his deathbed, and he says, I want you to give to this person my house that can fit 100 barrels. All right, this house is so big, it has this many square feet. If you put, barrels 10 this way and 10 that way, it could make 10 square barrels of area. I want you to give him my house that holds 100 barrels. And now they went to the house that he meant, right? He specified some house, and they measured it. And it turns out that house can hold 120 barrels. So now what do? Now the guy died, and we want to fulfill his will. So do we give him the whole house? Did he mean that house? Did he mean part of the house? So Mozu Tada explains that, listen, this guy in his deathbed said 100 barrels worth of space, and he did not say 120. And therefore, the receiver will only receive part of the house. He'll receive 5/6 of the house, enough to fit 100 barrels, but the other part of the house, someone else will get that. That's Mor Zutra's opinion. Rav Ashi Amar Milo Tenan Bamed Amorim Bemocher Ava Benoten Matana Noten Et Kulan Alma Mandeahi Matana Be'ayin Yafa Yahib Hachaname Mandeahi Matana Be'ayin Yafa Yahib. Rav Ashi disagrees with Mor Zutra and said, didn't we learn in the Mishnah that when do we say a seller is holding back when there's something ambiguous? When you say I'm giving you land, the cistern on it. Is that cistern part of it? Is it not part of it? Generally, it's not automatically part of the land. It's a separate item. And yet we said that the seller holds back only in the case of a sale. But if it's a gift, then he gets everything. He gets the cistern too. So we see that someone who gives a gift is generally being generous. Here too, this guy's on his deathbed and he's giving a gift. Right before I die, I want you to give that guy the house that can fit 100 barrels. Since he's being generous, and really it holds 120, so we assume that he would want to give the guy the entire house, even more than 100 barrels, even though the language was a little ambiguous. At the house, he said 100 barrels, we're going to round it up and give him the entire house. And so Rav Ashi brings a proof from our Mishnah that there's a difference between selling and giving gift. If he was selling it and he said 100 barrels, then that's it. The buyer only gets 100 barrels, but a gift is given generously. Hamakdish et hasadeh hikdish vechule. The Mishnah said that according to Tanakama, someone who consecrates a field is like a gift, and he gives everything that's in it, including the cistern. Whereas according to the Bishimon, that's the Bishimon Bar Yochai, he says that someone who consecrates a field is more like a sale, and therefore he is only giving the land, but is keeping the cistern. But even Rabbi Shimon would agree that he's giving over the trees, and that opinion will come up in the following discussion. Amar Rav Huna, Afagav Damur Rabbanan, Hakone Shene Ilanot Betoch Shel Chabero, Hare Ze Lo Kana Karka. Rav Huna is first quoting a Mishnah that we're going to see later on in the Masechet, that according to Rabbanan, someone who buys 2 trees, if I own a field with trees on it, and I sell you just 2 trees, then you do not acquire any part of the land. There's a distinction between 2 and 3 trees. If I sell you 3 trees, that's already called an orchard. And then you get 3 or more trees, you get the land also that are surrounding the trees. However, just 2 trees means only the trees themselves. I'm selling you the trees, but not any of the land. Even though that's true, machar karka v'shiyer shnei ilanot lefanav yesh lo karka. If it's the other way around, and again, I own land with trees on it, and I sell you the land, and I say I'm keeping for myself these 2 trees. In that case, I do own the land under the trees. And this would make sense according to Rabbanan, as opposed to Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbanan say that a seller sells be'ayin ra'ah, in a stingy way. So if I sell you trees, I'm selling you trees only with no land. And if I sell you my land and I'm keeping 2 trees, then I'm keeping for myself more. I'm keeping the land under the trees also. So that's very consistent, and that's the general opinion of Rabbanan, that a seller is stingy. But now, here is the chidush, that this is not clear if Rav Huna is saying this or if we're saying this in the name of Rav, that we're adding this onto Rav Huna. Either way, this is a secondary inference. Va'afilu l'Rabbi Akiva damar mocher be'ayin yafa mocher hanemi legaber bor v'dut ela kam machshi be'ar'a aval ilanot de kam machshi be'ar'a im ita de la shier lemale akor ilanach shekol v'ziel. This distinction between selling the trees versus selling the land is true not only for Rabbanan, but even Rabbi Akiva would agree with this. And even though he says in general that a seller sells generously, still there's limits to people's generosity. So when we say people sell generously, that is true regarding the pit and the cistern that do not weaken the land. And therefore, the seller says, listen, I'm selling you the land, I'm keeping for myself the cistern, but the cistern, I don't need any, I'm not assuming that I'm keeping any land around the cistern, and that's why the Rabbi Akiva says, I have to buy a pathway to it. And the reason that is because a cistern doesn't weaken the land at all. And so therefore, I'm selling you the land, I'm selling you all the land. I'm keeping the cistern and I'm keeping the pit. They're not weakening the land. And so you're not going to have any complaint against me. So since I'm giving you all the land and I'm doing it generously, I'm going to have to come later and buy a right to get to the cistern. That's what Rabbi Akiva said. However, when it comes to trees which weaken the land, because they draw nutrients and water from the soil, and you're trying to plant things on the field, and my tree is there. So if I don't, I'm the seller. If I don't keep some of the land for myself, then the buyer will come to me and say, hey, uproot your trees and take them out of here. Your trees are taking away sustenance from the other things that I'm trying to plant. The trees are very water hungry, and they'll take all the water from the little plants, and then the buyer will complain. So even Rabbi Akiva, who says that a seller is generous when it comes to a cistern, because cistern is not bothering the buyer, is not taking away nutrients, and so he won't have a problem. He'll just have to go and buy a pathway, which is not just a small pathway, that's no big deal. But when it comes to a tree, the seller wants to keep two trees. The seller knows that if he doesn't have any land under the tree, then he's going to have a problem because the buyer is going to complain. Hey, you're taking my sustenance, get your trees out of here. They're your trees, yeah, but just get them off my land. And I don't want that to happen. So therefore, even according to the Rabbi Akiva, when I sell you the land and I keep two trees, I do keep the land around the trees for myself. That's the thesis. Now we challenge this thesis from our Mishnah, Tenan. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Hamakdish et hasadeh lo ikdish ela harub hamurkav v'sadana shikma. V'tane Allah, Amar Rabbi Shimon matam, ho'il v'yonkin mesedeh hekdesh. So the challenge is going to be from Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Remember, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is actually a student of Rabbi Akiva. And he says that if I consecrate my land, so I consecrate the land only, like a sale, and I don't give the cistern or the wine press. However, I do not. It says I do not make consecrated except for those things, the wine press, but I do consecrate the trees, the grafted carob tree and the large sycamore tree. We have a baraita about that. And Rabbi Shimon says, what's the reason why he rules that way? Because these trees are drawing sustenance from the land. And since I consecrated the field and these trees are drawing sustenance to it, therefore the owner must have in mind that he wants to donate the trees as well. That was Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Here's the question. And if you say that a seller who's selling land but keeping trees always has in mind to retain some of the land around the trees, we just said, but both according to Rabbanan and according to Rabbi Akiva, who says that generally a person is generous, we just made the thesis that even according to Rabbi Akiva, a seller who sells land but keeps trees wants to make sure to keep the land under the trees that it's drawing sustenance from. If that's true, then Rabbi Shimon should not say that the trees are given as hikdesh, because the owner would therefore have in mind, listen, I'm consecrating the land. But he's having in mind he's keeping the trees because he's keeping the cistern also. It's like a sale. He's only selling the land itself, not any of the significant items. A sycamore tree is significant. And if you say that he assumes that he's keeping not only the tree but also the land under the tree, then there's no problem. The tree is not drawing from sustenance from consecrated land. He's keeping the land also. So we see that certainly Rabbi Shimon would not agree with this inference regarding Rabbi Akiva. And therefore, we conclude, Rabbi Shimon Damar ke Rabbi Akiva. In fact, Rabbi Shimon follows Rabbi Akiva, which again makes sense. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is a student of Rabbi Akiva. And he says, not like the inference that we just said, either that Rav Huna said or that we said based on his words. It makes more sense that it was based on his words because we're about to quote Rav Huna. Rabbi Shimon follows Rabbi Akiva's plain language that a seller is generous, always generous. And just like in a cistern, the seller sells the cistern. Just like in a cistern, the seller sells the land and keeps the cistern, but keeps none of the land. He has to buy a pathway. So too, when he sells the land and he keeps two trees, then he gives away all of the land. He doesn't own any of the land. He only owns the trees. Rabbi Shimon follows that. And that's why Rabbi Shimon says, yeah, when you're selling, that was all for a sale. So when you're consecrating, that's like selling. And so too, if I'm consecrating or selling the land, so I'm consecrating the land only, but I'm going to keep everything else for myself. However, since I'm consecrating all the land and the trees draw from the land, therefore I have to give the land also, because that's what we assume the owner is thinking. That's Rabbi Shimon. Rav Huna follows the opinion of Rabbanan against Rabbi Akiva, who says that a seller is going to sell stingily, and therefore, if I am selling you 2 trees and I'm keeping the land, then all you get is the 2 trees and you get no land under it. If you flip it around and I'm selling you the land and I'm keeping 2 trees for myself, then I keep not only the trees, I also keep the land under the trees. That's what Avuna said, and that makes perfect sense. According to Rabbanan, that is, it's always going to be stingy. A seller is always going to be stingy. Now, last question. Rabbanan pishita. Of course, isn't what Rav Huna's explanation of Rabbanan is obvious? We already know that Rabbanan says that a seller is stingy. So isn't that obvious that then the seller means that if the seller's keeping the trees, he's going to keep also the land under the trees. That's what Rabbanan said also regarding a cistern. If I sell you the land and I keep the cistern, I keep a pathway. I do keep some land so that I can use it properly. And the same thing would be for a tree. I'm selling you the land, I keep the tree. Obviously, according to Rabbanan, I'm going to keep the land under the tree. So what's Rav Huna teaching us that we didn't know ourselves? The answer is nafkamina dinafle hadar shatil lehu. The difference is that if the tree falls, that the seller retains the right to plant it again. In other words, even without Avuna, I could figure out myself that according to the Rabbanan, since I'm the seller and the seller is stingy, and I'm selling you the land, and I'm keeping 2 trees, obviously I keep the right for those trees to get sustenance from the land. So I'm keeping that land under the tree. But what if the tree dies? So now I might say I only had the right for this tree to be on that land and get sustenance. But if that tree dies, then that's it. I lose the right. So that's Rav Huna's chidush, that when a seller keeps for himself the tree, he retains for himself not only the right for that tree to have sustenance, but even a future tree. If that one should die, I have a right to plant a new tree in that same spot because I kept for myself the future rights of that area of land. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.